In the last lesson, we got our Homeworld UI all set up, and now we need some data to populate our labels. One thing that I did notice, though, let's zoom in here and select our stack view. Okay, so the parent stack view to the 4 other ones. What we actually want here for alignment, you'll notice that these stack views aren't filling the stack view parent. So we want this to be fill, and then the distribution to be fill equally. And now the stack views, yep, there they go. They are now filling it up. All right, let's also change each of these to just empty. So dash dash, dash dash, dash dash, and dash dash. All right, great. All right, so now we can get started. And the first thing that we're going to need is a model for our data to be stored in. So similar to what we did with our person.swift file, a structure that will represent the data that will be coming from our JSON. So if you recall in our swappy, we can see here we have name, climate, terrain, and population, and those look like they are all of type string, okay? So let's go ahead and create our structure that will hold the data that we return from the API. So jumping back into Xcode, I'm going to create a new file here in model, right-clicking, new file, Swift file, and say next. And we're going to call this simply Homeworld and create. Okay, and we're going to create a structure, and the name is going to be Homeworld, and we are going to start out with Codable. I'm not going to make you go through the 3 processes of parsing JSON again. We're just going to start out with Codable, and our fields, we have let name of type string, that's the planet name, let climate of type string, oh, there we go, get a C in there, let terrain of type string, and let population of type string. All right, and you'll notice that our fields and the JSON keys already match up. So we don't actually have to do that enum coding keys thing again like we did in person, because our structure property names and the JSON keys already match up. So that's pretty nice. All right, so I'm going to save that. And the next thing that we're going to need is a class that is going to actually perform the web request for us. All right, so I'm going to create a new file here under services, and I'm going to say new file, and this can be a Swift file. I'm going to say next, and we're going to call this Homeworld API. All right, and I'm going to say create. And we are going to need Alamo Fire, and we're going to call this class Homeworld API. There we go. All right, so just like in our person API.swift, we're going to create a function to go and get the data from this endpoint. So we have our base URL plus planets and then the specific planet. That's all given to us already, though, in our person structure. We have the Homeworld URL. So all we need to do is create a function that accepts a URL, has a completion handler, does the Alamo request, and then decodes the JSON. All right, so let's say func get home world, and we're going to pass into it a URL of type string that we are going to get from the person that we have passed from our select person VC to our Homeworld VC. And then we're going to need a completion. And remember, that is escaping. And let's go ahead and create a new type alias. And we have our other type alias here in our utils folder under constants. And I'm just going to copy this type alias and paste it, and let's call this Homeworld response completion, and this is going to be taking a Homeworld structure object. All right, let's save that, come back into Homeworld API, and go ahead and put that right here, Homeworld response completion. Great, now let's go ahead and get this URL. So this is going to be a string. We need to turn it into a URL object, and that returns an optional. So we're going to need to unwrap it. So I'm going to say guard let URL is equal to URL, and that's going to be initialized with a string, which is the string that we pass into this function. And we're going to say else return. So if it is not a well-formed string for a URL, then we'll just return out of this function. Next up, we need to make our Alamo Fire request. I'm going to say Alamo Fire dot request, and this is the one that we want right here. We pass in the URL, and then we add our response handler. Okay, so we're going to say response JSON. We are expecting JSON to come back. So I'm going to say return and then type in response in code. Okay, so Alamo Fire is going to make the request for us from this URL that is passed in. And then when we get JSON back, we have access to the data, any possible errors, and the response right here in this argument here. So let's go ahead and do a check to make sure that we don't have any errors. So I'm going to say if let error is equal to response.result.error. So if there was an error, we are going to say, we're going to debug print the error. So I'm going to say error.localized description. Then we're going to say completion nil. And then we are going to return out of the function. If we were successful though, let's go ahead and get the data. So I'm going to say guard let data equal to response.data, and it's optional. That's why we are doing the guard let data. Else, we are going to return the completion with nil. Okay, so if we were unsuccessful at getting the data, then we're just going to return. And then all we need to do is do our JSON decoding. So we're going to get a JSON decoder, let JSON decoder equal JSON decoder, initialize that. And then we just need to do our do try catch block. And I'm going to say do and then catch. And here in the do, we are going to say let Homeworld equal, and we're going to try to decode the JSON into a Homeworld instance. So I'm going to say JSON decoder dot decode, and so we pass in the type and the data, and the type that we want it to decode into is of course a Homeworld dot self, and then from the data that we just unwrapped. And if that doesn't work as expected, we are going to catch the error and debug print it. So I'm going to say error.localized description, and we will say completion nil. All right, and then what are we going to do with this Homeworld instance that is created for us? We are going to say completion and pass in that Homeworld object. Perfect. Let's go ahead and clean this up just a little bit. All right, that looks great. So now we have this Homeworld API class with a function to get the Homeworld, and it will return to us a Homeworld instance that we can then use to populate our UI labels. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's jump over to Homeworld vc.swift, and let's go ahead and initialize a Homeworld class. I'm going to say let API equal Homeworld API, and let's initialize that. And here in view.did.load, let's go ahead and call that. So I'm going to say API.getHomeworld URL, and the URL that we need, we have from our person that was passed over from the main VC, person.homeworld URL. Here we go. And then completion, we just do return, and we can say Homeworld. And then right here, let's go ahead and create a function that will set up our UI. So I'm going to say func setup UI. And we're going to pass into this function a Homeworld of type Homeworld. And from there, oh, I just realized that we have not hooked up any of our outlets for this home world. All right, so I'm going to hold Option and click on main.storyboard. And we are going to hook up our Homeworld's IB outlets. I'm going to zoom in here and let's see here. Okay, right here. All right, so I'm going to open up these stack views and I'm going to control and drag in from our document outline. All right, so this is control and drag right here. And this is the name label. Then here we have the climate label. And here we have the terrain label. And lastly, we have the population label. Very good. So those are all hooked up now. Now we can update those from our function here. So I'm going to say name label dot text is equal to, and then we can access the homeworld's name from our instance that we get from our api.getHomeworld function. So I'm going to say homeworld dot name. What's next? Climate label dot text is equal to homeworld dot climate. Terrain label dot text is equal to homeworld dot terrain. And lastly, population label dot text is equal to homeworld dot population. And then we can call that right here in our closure. But first we're going to want to make sure that homeworld exists, because this could be nil if something goes wrong in the API. And so we're going to say if let homeworld is equal to homeworld, then we are going to say setup UI and pass in that homeworld, okay? So this is the unwrapped version of the homeworld here. Oh, and because we are in a closure, we need to add self dot. All right, and that is it. Let's go ahead and run this and see how it looks. All right, so clicking on random, we get this person, and let's click on their home world, and there we go. Nice. We are retrieving from the API the home world information. We are parsing it and setting it right here, all right? So that is pretty awesome. So just to recap, we created our model. We created a structure, conform to codable. Then we created an API class to go and retrieve that data using Alamo Fire. We get the data, and then we use the JSON decoder to decode the data into an instance of the home world structure. And then we have our completion handler that once all of that is done, it passes that data to our home world view controller, where we set up the UI using that instance of the home world. All right, so pretty simple and straightforward now that we know what we're doing. So yeah, hopefully this went smoothly for you. If not, go ahead and rewatch it, and we're going to be doing this a few more times for our other views. All right, so we'll get working on that in the next one. See you there.